Alrighty, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining Women Campaign's Toast to Tenacity program today. My name is Logan, and I am the director at Women Campaign, and my colleague Megan is also with me. She founded Women Campaign, but before we begin, I just wanted to briefly give you an introduction about Vision 2020 and the history of the Toast to Tenacity celebrations. Vision 2020 is a national nonpartisan women's equality coalition headquartered at Drexel University's Institute for Women's Health and Leadership in Philadelphia. The coalition is made up of individual leaders and organizations working to achieve economic, political, and social equality for women in the U.S. Through hundreds of delegates and allied organizations representing millions of members across the United States, Vision 2020 seeks to accelerate the pace of women's progress. Women Campaign is a proud allied organization of Vision 2020, and we will be a part of their national Congress earlier next year. Additionally, today, August 26th, is the day the 19th Amendment was adopted in 1920 and is recognized nationwide as Women's Equality Day. Each year on this day, Vision 2020's Toast to Tenacity honors the suffragists who fought for this right and urges women to shape the future by exercising their right to vote. And now I would like to turn over the mic to Megan just to give a few remarks about Women Campaign and let y'all know what we're doing. Megan.
Thank you, Logan. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm so excited for you all to be here to join Women Campaign and the fact that we can be part of this historical event. And I think that as we've seen so much in the news lately, we see how much need there is for women to be more involved in our government. And so Women Campaign is an organization that I founded because women do campaign and women are changing the world, but yet women continue to be underrepresented in elected office. So we created this organization with the goal of training and supporting and encouraging women to think about running for office. And our goal is to start introducing them to the things that they can be doing now while they are, even before they run for office, to prepare themselves for success when it is time to run for office. And so of the services we provide, we include training programs for folks who want to be more effective in talking to their local city council and making changes in their community, all the way up to teaching candidates the basic fundamentals and helping them start a political campaign. And so if anyone in our crowd is interested in running for office at some point, please be sure to reach out to us. And in the meantime, thank you for joining us today as we celebrate this historic event for women. Thank you, Logan.
Thank you, Megan. And before we go into the main part of our program, I would like to do a toast with you all to toast to 100 years of women's suffrage. I'm going to read you off the toast that they just had at the National Toast to Tenacity celebration a few moments ago. So if everyone can raise their glass. On this day, on this 100th anniversary of American women's right to vote, we salute the suffragists with gratitude for what they did in their time, with determination to do what we must do in our time, in honor of their tenacity and the work they started. We pledge to complete the unfinished work to achieve equality and justice for all. Cheers, everyone. Alrighty, and now I would like to introduce Patricia Ann Pierce, who is representing the National Women's History Alliance today. She is retired from Vanderbilt University. She retired from Vanderbilt University in 2007 after a career of almost 30 years as the Senior Director of the Opportunity Development Center. She achieved outstanding success in the academic world and is recognized internationally as an advocate for diversity and equality. She has presented numerous programs on gender issues, sexual harassment, and cultural diversity for community, regional, national, and international conferences. She has served as a member of 37 organizations, as president or vice president of 10, and is a member of the board of directors of 20 organizations, 2 being international. She has also served as the chair of the Board of Commissioners of the Tennessee Human Rights Commission for 3 years. Currently, she is a member of the Economic Council Foundation Board, board member of the Nashville Sports Council, where she has served on the Legacy Committee for the 2014 Women's Final Four basketball tournament. She is a member of the Tennessee Women's Suffrage Monument Board, treasurer of the Athena International Honorary Board, president of the National Women's History Project Board, and a national delegate to Vision 2020. She is also a founding member of the Women in Higher Education in Tennessee. Her awards include the Rotary International Jean Harris Award, YWCA Academy of Women of Achievement, Women in Higher Education in Tennessee, June Anderson Award, the 2003 Nashville Athena Award, 2006 Tennessee Economic Councils of Excellence and Equality Award, Tennessee State University's 2008 Women of Legend and Merit Award, and Nashville Cable's prestigious Molly Todd Cup, which is given to a woman who spends much of her life making the world a better place to live. She is a graduate of Leadership America, Leadership Nashville, and the Oxford University Roundtable, and is an inductee to the Tennessee International Women's Forum. She has a BS degree from the University of Tennessee, where she played basketball in 1968 under Joan Cronin. She completed the Bryn Mawr University Institute for Women in Higher Education Administration and the National Institute for Leadership Development at Arizona State. So everyone, I would like to welcome Patricia Ann Pierce to give her remarks about what it took to win the vote back in 1920. Thank you for being here, Patricia. Whoops, you may need to unmute your mic.
Now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Oh, good. I'm so happy to be here. Can you hear my bell? Was it loud enough?
Yes, we can.
Okay, the ringing of the bells. I don't know if you've heard about that, but back in 1920, people across the United States rang bells to celebrate the 19th Amendment ratification. A little side note to that is Tennessee, which was the state that ratified as the 36th state, people in Tennessee did not ring bells because they were not real happy at that time. They were trying to find a way to do a lawsuit to change the vote. So people in Nashville didn't ring bells. But guess what? We did this year because we're celebrating the centennial of women winning the right to vote. You hear a lot of descriptions about women gained the right to vote. We got the right to vote. We actually won the right to vote. It was a very long battle of 72 years that very strong, persistent women of tenacity all worked together to get the right to vote. And it was a diverse group, even though you probably haven't heard about the diversity in the suffrage movement. You know, when I started about 10 years ago talking about women's suffrage, I was really surprised that so few people knew about women's suffrage or the history of women's suffrage. And I know that the National Women's Museum organization did a survey, and they found that 1 in 4 people really knew little about women's history. Women tended to know a little bit more, but men knew very little about women's accomplishments throughout the country. And you know, there have been so many women prominent in so many different things, but nobody knows anything about them. So I'm going to ask you if you've ever heard of a young girl. She was 16 years old. Her name was Sybil Ludington. Anybody heard of Sybil? No. Well, have you heard of Paul Revere and his famous ride? Everybody's heard of Paul Revere, I know. You read about Paul Revere in history. Well, Sybil was the daughter of a soldier, and her dad asked her to ride her horse at night in the rain twice as far as Paul Revere to warn the people in the next town that the British were coming. So Sybil was a hero, and actually George Washington gave her a citation for that, but she's not written about in history. But there is a monument for her in New York, so that's wonderful. But there are so many women who've done things throughout history that people don't know anything about. And the women's suffrage movement is one of those movements that for so many years, people don't know about what all the women went through. You know, back in the 1800s and 1900s, it wasn't an easy time. Women traveled across this country in trains. Some drove cars across the country on dirt roads. They did a lot of things to try to get people to listen to their message about women needed the right to vote. There were no drive-in fast foods. There were no laundromats. They did it out of courage, and they did it out of the conviction that women getting the right to vote was really important. So I want to give you a little bit of history about what happened during those 72 years. If you remember, in 1776, at the Constitutional Convention, Abigail Adams told her husband, "Remember the ladies, don't forget us, we're really important." And that's a picture of Abigail Adams. And she was probably our first suffragist. Didn't really know it, but she was very powerful in wanting to get the voices of women heard. So that was really early on. In 1848, the first women's conference was held in Seneca Falls. Now, I'm sure you've probably heard about Seneca Falls, but there were about 300 women and 40 men meeting in Seneca Falls. It's a large group because they only started planning for it. That was Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott planning for it about 3 weeks before. So the only way they could publicize is through newspapers at that time. And they had a good crowd. And they discussed a lot of issues pertaining to women, because women couldn't do anything back in the 1900s. They couldn't own property. If they had a divorce, the husband would get the custody of the children. Of course, they couldn't vote. There was no freedom for women at that time. So they developed a document was similar to the Declaration of Independence, but it was called the Declarations of Rights and Sentiments. And that was their document that changed the word "we the people." Now, when you think about "we the people," you think we're included in that, but when that was written, it did not include anyone but white males. So they changed it to include all people of all races and whatever. And in that document, they had statements, and one of those statements was getting women the right to vote. That was the hardest one at that convention to get passed, but it eventually passed after a passionate speech by Frederick Douglass. Now, Frederick Douglass is an African-American man, and he was there, and he was always in support of women's right to vote. So he gave a passionate speech, and it passed. And so that was the Declarations of Rights and Sentiment, and that was the document that they used as their Declaration of Independence. From that time on, they began working together. And when Susan B. Anthony came into the picture, she was certainly a very strong advocate for women's rights, particularly women's right to vote. And when the 14th Amendment passed, saying that citizens could vote, she took the courage to go out and vote. She was arrested. She went to court, and she was fined $100, which she didn't pay, but the rumor is that somebody paid it for her because she did not have to go to jail. But she felt like she should be a citizen of this United States because she paid taxes, and she felt like that was the time for women to stand up. A lot of other women throughout the country went to vote. Sojourner Truth went to vote, but she was turned away at the polls as well. But Susan B. actually did go in and try to vote. So there are a lot of women who did some courageous things back in the early 1900s. And I want to say specifically that African-American women were very active. They were behind the scenes because it wasn't as easy for them to be up front with the white women, but they were behind the scenes working on suffrage. Some of those women were Frances Harper. She was a poet, and she went around talking about suffrage, and she used poetry, and she actually was paid for speaking. She was evidently an eloquent speaker, and this is Frances Harper. And Sojourner Truth, I should have put these on the screen, but I didn't. I hope you can see them. Sojourner Truth also was a famous suffragist, and she gave a speech at a conference in Ohio. And it is a famous speech. And if you've never heard her speech, Ain't I a Woman, you need to look it up, because it is a beautiful speech, and it makes a lot of sense because, she also was suffering from having been a slave. So she had not just voting rights, but just human rights in general against her. So she was very powerful. And what was really interesting too is Black women got together in church, and churches and clubs were how Black women got together and talked about women's suffrage. And they were definitely there, and they were very outspoken. And there was a parade, one of the largest parades in New York, that was put together by Alice Paul, who was a very famous militant suffragist. It's interesting, while I'm talking about the word suffragist, a lot of people refer to the women in the United States as suffragettes, but suffragettes is not the appropriate term, because Susan B. Anthony chose specifically the word suffragist, which just means to vote. The word suffragette originated in Europe, in England particularly. It was a word that the media brought up, and it was really a negative term, because the ETT, suffragettes meant diminutive, small, and they were trying to belittle the women in England, but the women in England liked it, and they kept the word suffragette. And they're looked at as being much more militant, because they did a lot of things that didn't happen here in the United States, like they burned down buildings, and they did a lot of rioting and other things. And we would like to say that our suffragist movement was nonviolent. It was nonviolent by the suffragist here in the United States, but there was a lot of violence against the suffragists, because people would, when they would get up to speak, people would throw fruit and vegetables and eggs and other things at them. In the winter, they would throw cold water on them. And the women who were considered the silent sentinels in Washington, and that was a group led by Alice Paul, because Alice Paul went to England and she actually trained under the suffragettes, and she came back, and she was much more active than Susan B. Anthony. Of course, Alice was younger, and she felt like she was tired of waiting. She wanted to get things done. So this protest at the White House gates was actually the first protest against the president at the White House. And these women, many of them were arrested. They never said a word. They just had their signs that said, "How long must we wait?" They were arrested for obstruction and sent to prison. And many of them suffered a lot of violence against them. Some of them were force-fed. They were beaten. There were other things. And that was kind of the turn of the times when people started to see these women were really serious, and this was really important for women to have the right to vote. And so things went along. In 1876, Lucy Stone, another suffragist, decided that they were going to protest the celebration of the centennial of the country. And so they refused to pay their taxes, and they protested at the celebration, and some of them were arrested. Some of their property was seized, and some of them were put in jail for that. So there was a lot of protest, but the women did not do anything like burning down buildings or throwing burning bottles at police or anything like that. They did it in a very respectful way, because they wanted people to see that they were serious about wanting the right to vote. So the Black women were, I was going to tell you about the parade. The large parade, there were thousands, probably 8,000 to 10,000 people marching in this parade. And Ida B. Wells, who was a prominent African-American woman, decided she was going to march in the parade. She helped with the planning of the parade, but she was told by some of the parade organizers that she would have to march in the back of the group. She intended to march with the women from Chicago, because that's where she was. And so she had started her own suffrage group called the Alpha group, and they were women suffragists working for suffrage for all women, including women of color. So what she did, she refused to do that. She just stood back in the crowd, and when her Chicago group came in front of her, she stepped out and marched right along with them. So she had a lot of courage too, wanting to make sure that she was a woman that deserved respect and the right to vote as well. So those were some of the prominent. There are many others. And if you watched the Vision 2020 program earlier, there was a very special presentation about other Black women who were involved in the suffrage movement. And they were highlighted on that program. And I would encourage you to go back and look at them, because there are many, many others besides Sojourner Truth and Frances Harper and Ida B. Wells. There are Mary Church Terrell and several others that you may have not heard of, but you should know about what they've done, because they did some amazing things. The women out west had the right to vote, and the western states were, there's a wonderful map, and I had it here, but I don't see it, of the western women raising their hands, encouraging the eastern and the mid part of the country to come with them for vote. Colorado was the first state to give women the right to vote. Wyoming and Utah were the other states. The western states were giving women the right to vote so they could encourage more women to come west. So that was one of the ways that they wanted to get women to come. Excuse me just a second. I was trying to get my clock so I know I could stay on time, to encourage women to come to the West, and they were giving them the right to vote in the Western states. There were many strategies used to get women the right to vote. They thought they would do state-by-state campaigns, so that's when they traveled all over the country. That wasn't working very well. So then Susan B. Anthony handed the leadership over to Carrie Chapman Cat. Susan B., this is Carrie Chapman Cat. Susan B. Did not live to see her amendment become ratified. She died before it happened, but Carrie Chapman Cat was a very prominent leader. She was kind of, I think they called her the general. She was a strong, strong leader, but she still was not as radical as Alice Paul, but she wanted this constitutional amendment to happen. So the 19th Amendment was actually first mentioned in Congress. It was introduced in 1869, and then it came back in 1878, and it was introduced every year until it was finally ratified in 1919. So in 1919, 36 states had to ratify, because there were only 48 states at the time, had to ratify the 19th Amendment in order for it to go back to Washington and become official. And that was happening all over the country. And 35 states ratified, but it took a while and it kind of bogged down. And there were several eastern states that were possibilities. And then people were not looking at the southern states, because southern states were known for racism and not wanting to give rights to any person of color. And so they were hoping for Delaware. It looked like the best chance. But when it came down to the vote, it failed. So it looked like the only other possibility would be Tennessee. And so I'm proud to be from Tennessee, because Tennessee was the perfect 36. Tennessee was the state that finally ratified, but it was not easy. It was very difficult. We had people come from all over the country, including Carrie Chapman Cat. And we just had wonderful celebrations last week, because August the 18th was the actual day that Tennessee ratified it here in our state legislature. Carrie Chapman Cat came down. August in Tennessee, well, I'm sure Texas is hot too, but it's so hot and muggy and the humidity is terrible. She came down thinking she would be here for a short time, but she was here for almost a month, getting all the women organized and getting people ready to start lobbying for the approval of the amendment. And so I don't know if you know Nashville at all, but there's a beautiful old historic hotel called the Hermitage Hotel. And it is right across the street from the state capitol. And this was the location for the suffragist, pro-suffragist, but it was also the location for the anti-suffragist. So there was a national group of women who were against women getting the right to vote, and they set up their office in the Hermitage Hotel. So it was really kind of an interesting setting for all the activity that was going on at the time to get the bill either passed or not. And so the antis wore red roses, which signified they were against it. The pro-suffragists wore yellow roses, which said they were for suffragists. So we call this the War of the Roses. And it was a war because they were back and forth. You can just imagine in the early 1900s and 1920 what was going on. Because in the Hermitage Hotel was also a nice room called the Jack Daniels room. And liquor was free to any of the legislators. So people were just lobbying people. And Carrie Chapman Cat was asked, were the people that you were talking to, the legislators, were they drunk? And her answer was, well, yes, they were, because there was a lot of stuff going on. And back in those days, there were a lot of lobbyists for different things. And so the railroad people were against suffragists. Some of the business organizations were against suffrage. So there was a lot of stuff going on. I would love to have been in that Jack Daniels room, but no women were allowed. And Sue Shelton White, which is one of the Tennessee suffragists, actually was caught at the door listening, and she was escorted out. And there was a big article in the Nashville paper talking about the spies up in the room listening to what was going on in the Jack Daniels room, because most of the people in there were the legislators. So it was a really interesting thing. Sue Shelton White is one of the Tennessee suffragists who went to Washington and joined the suffragists there. And in New York, she was one of Alice Paul's right-hand women, and she helped a whole lot in what was going on with the Alice Paul group instead of the Carrie Chapman group. They were just really different, two women's organizations working for suffrage in a lot of different ways. So the War of the Roses went on for about 3 weeks, and Carrie Chapman Cat was getting really frustrated because it looked like from the count of the roses that the vote was not going to happen. The House Senate in Tennessee passed it without a problem, but it came to the House of Representatives, and there was a 3-day battle going on there because the representatives were trying to table the amendment. And the vote went on the first time, and it was tied. The second time, and it was tied. The third and final call for the vote was where the excitement happened. The women are sitting in the balcony because, of course, they're not allowed in the gallery and or in the floor, on the floor. They were counting roses again, and it looked like they were too short. But when the final vote came to a count, the young man from Nyota, Tennessee, McMinn County, who was the youngest legislator in the House of Representatives, changed his vote. He was wanting to table it, so he was voting to table it. Changed his vote to aye, and the tie was broken. And it was like, they said, pandemonium broke out, and people were screaming, the antis were screaming, oh no, and the women who were pros were happy and celebrating, and it was a wonderful occasion for them. And Harry Byrne, if you haven't heard about him, that very morning had received a letter from his mother. And his mother was wondering, she had not heard what his vote would be. And she wanted him to vote Yes. She told him that it was important for him to speak up. And her letter said, "Hooray and vote for suffrage. Don't keep them in doubt. I noticed some of the speeches against. They were bitter. I have been watching to see how you stood, but have not noticed anything yet. Don't forget, be a good boy and help Mrs. Cat put the rat in ratification." And she signed it, "Your mother." Now, it was a long letter, but this is a piece of that, and this letter is in the one of the Tennessee museums. She wrote the letter in pencil, and she put it in an envelope and asked her older son to write it in ink to address it to him. And it's addressed to Harry Burns, state capital, Nashville, Tennessee. But he got it the morning of this vote. And so he had it in his breast pocket. And he said he seriously thought about what to do. And he knew his mother was an educated woman. Her name was Febburn. She was educated. She'd went to college. She ran the family business. They had a farm. And she said, you know, I can't vote, but my farm hands and workers out here in the field who cannot even read and write, they have the right to vote. It's not fair. And he knew that wasn't fair. And so he changed his vote and he voted aye. And two other legislators actually changed their vote, but it passed. And the reason that the bell ringing didn't happen in Nashville or Tennessee is because there were several lawsuits filed to get the vote thrown out. They alleged all kinds of things, but it did not happen. And on the 24th of August, the governor, A.H. Roberts, signed the ratification and sent it to Washington, D.C. And the U.S. Secretary of the State, his name was Bainbridge, Kobe Bainbridge, one of those, signed it officially early in the morning and it became law. So August the 26th is Women's Equality Day. And it's a day that we've celebrated every year and should be continued to be celebrated every year from now on, because that is the actual date that the legislation became official and part of the constitutional amendment. So it was 144 years from the Declaration of Independence, and it was 72 years from the beginning of the suffrage movement, but it finally happened. And Carrie Chapman Cat says, "I have lived to realize the great dream of my life, the enfranchisement of women. We are no longer petitioners. We are no longer wards of the nation, but free and equal citizens. Let us practice the dignity of sovereign people." Well, that was her words, and I wish it was totally true, because it wasn't totally true, because voting rights was not the same for everyone, and all women did not receive the equal right to vote. The ERA has yet to pass, and there's still a lot of issues going on with women in regard to equal pay. And so we're not there yet. But I want to say that we need to cherish the right to vote. We need to cherish the fact that we did stand on the shoulders of very, very strong women who worked and fought very hard to get the right to vote, to win the right to vote. And we need to use that right and that power, because voting is power, to change anything that we want to change. If all the women who are eligible to vote got out and voted, we could elect anyone we want to serve into office. We can change the face of our country, because we know that women are strong leaders, and we know that women have great power and courage and determination and care about people and families, that we can make a difference. And look at the world and the number of women leaders around the world, and our country has yet to do that. So we really need to make that happen. And so I want to encourage everybody to run for office and to get everybody in your family to vote. People say, my vote doesn't count. Well, there was an election in the state capital in Tennessee where one vote made a difference. Someone was elected to office. Even though it was challenged, it was recounted. It ended up being one vote made a difference. And so every vote can make a difference. So I think it's really important. And Harry Burns said this. He said, they asked him why he changed his vote. And he said, well, I know a mother's advice is always safer for her boy to follow. And my mother wanted me to vote for ratification. And then in an interview later on, he made the statement, I appreciated the fact that an opportunity such as this seldom comes to a mortal man to free 17 million women from political slavery. That choice was mine. So 17 million women won the right to vote. Now, the Voters' Right Act of 1965 did finally come about and allow people, Black individuals, to vote, African American persons to vote. And that was not till 1965. Many of the other women, the Native American women, Asian women, but that was much later on too, that they were given the right to vote. And so it is not something I want to say that is just a celebration for everybody getting the right to vote. It was a beginning for making it eligible for other people to be able to vote. But we need to celebrate the fact that this is a centennial of an important decision in our country. I want you to know, let's see, I think I've just went over my time, but I'll say something really quickly. Monuments. It is so important to have monuments that people look up to and see, hey, this is the President of the United States. I can be that woman because there's a monument there. The monuments in our country in the past have represented men in general. Over 5,000 monuments have been identified as real people. Less than 300 were women. Less than 40 were women of color. We need to change that picture, and the women's suffrage movement has changed it, and the celebration has changed it. You've seen monuments going on all over the country. Central Park is dedicating their monument today. There was not a monument of women in Central Park. And so now there are going to be lots of monuments of women all over the country. And we need to celebrate that because these are monuments little girls can look up to and say, hey, I can do that. I can be that person. I wanted to show you a picture of the Tennessee monument. It is a monument of 5 women, including Carrie Chapman Cat, and 4 other women who helped Tennessee become the perfect 36. One of those women is an African-American woman by the name of Frankie Pierce, who did a lot in Tennessee to change things for women in general, but certainly for women of color. And Dallas Dudley, Sue Shelton White, and Abby Crawford Milton. So they're all on this monument. It's in Centennial Park. And we had a dedication to that last week. And it's on YouTube if you want to look at that dedication. So I could talk forever, but I want you to be able to ask me any questions.
Well, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Patricia. I'll just be taking questions in the text box from anyone who has any questions. I see we have 2 so far. We have one first from Kate. She said, how long did women protest in the United States before they were granted the right to vote?
Would you ask that again? I'm sorry.
How long did women protest in the United States before they were granted the right to vote?
Oh, it was 72 years. 72 years of protest. And you know, think about it, in 1800s and 1900s, how did they protest? You know, they did it through marches, mostly. They did it through pamphlets. They had the Suffragist magazine that they published. There was an African-American publication that was the first publication by an African-American woman talking about these issues. It all actually began with the abolitionists wanting to end slavery, but then it moved on into the suffragists. So it was 72 years, sending letters. And you know, one of the ways it started was tea parties. If you remember, women could not really go out in public by themselves, but they could go to tea rooms. And so women went to tea rooms, and this is where a lot of the strategy was planned. So that's why you'll see a lot of things about tea parties, because that is one of the ways that women got together and planned what they're going to do to protest.
Good. We have one other question from Megan. What can each of us be doing to take the next step to make the ERA happen?
Well, we have a lot of things available to us today that women in the past did not have. And one of the things that we have is social media. I think that we need to be doing a lot of lobbying to our legislators, letting them know that this is something that's really important to us. You need to find out about what's going on with the ERA. Where is it? What's happening to it? It would have passed if Virginia had passed it, but there's now a conflict going on about whether the date has expired for states to ratify it. So you need to read about it. You need to know your history, and you need to do the research to find out if we can research and know what's been done in the past, and then we can build on it for the future. So you need to research the ERA, find out what's going on, what your state has done, and then start working with other young women across the country to get this to happen, because that's really the only way it's going to happen.
Good. Do you have any resources in mind for all of us to take a look at?
Resources? Well, know more about this history. There are several really, really great books, and the one book that I recommend is The Women's Hour. If you haven't read this book, it's by Elaine Weiss. She's been on TV quite a bit lately talking about what's going on, but this really talks about the whole suffrage movement. It's a lot about Tennessee, but it's also a lot about the country and the South and what some of the issues that were involved in suffragists. There are still oppressions going on in voting rights, and we need to make sure that everybody has the right to vote. And we need to make sure that our legislators are not imposing issues involving voting that keep certain groups out from voting. And that's what we need to watch for the future. And get, as your group does, encourage women to run for office and encourage women to vote, because that is so important. And all these young women who are just coming up age-wise able to vote, they need to understand how important it is.
Well, good. And we just have one last question. We can make it very brief. What can young people and other groups with limited power learn from the actions of the suffragist?
They can learn what true courage means. They can certainly know that it takes persistence, continuous action, and the tenacity that we've heard a lot about today. Those are the things that young women need to understand and engage in, those types of activities that brings about awareness and this education of how important it is for women to vote and why it is sacred for us to vote because of the woman that came before us. That's what we need to understand.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much for your presentation, Patricia, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm going to post our website in the chat box if you'd like to take a look, and if you ever want to, if you decide you want to run for office, which hopefully you do, will be a good resource for you, as well as registering to vote. If you need help with knowing if you're registered to vote or how to register to vote, you can always email us at hello@womencampaign.com, and we'll make sure to get that taken care of for you and get you registered to vote so that your voice is heard this November. So thank you all again for joining us, and if you have any questions, just feel free to email us, and we really appreciate all of the great work that you're doing, Patricia, to make sure that everyone gets the history and information that we need to continue our movement forward. So thank you, everyone.
Is this going to be posted on your website? Did you record it?
Yes, yeah, we recorded this presentation.
Well, I will share that with other groups too. So I just keep sharing the information, and hopefully we can educate more people.
Yes. Good. All righty. Well, everyone have a nice day and a great week. Thank you for joining.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
Bye.